Hello everyone. Welcome to the Comms Corner, a new series with React and Share, where we check in with some inspiring comms leaders at the forefront of the industry. My name is Daisy. I'm a part of the marketing team at React and Share, and it is my pleasure to introduce Hayat Rachi, React and Share's CMO, and Camilla Mankabady, Director of Comms at Liverpool City Council. Thank you so much, Camilla, for contributing to our first episode. We're so excited to have you on board. I'll be overseeing this session from an admin perspective, but I'll be switching off my camera so that I don't distract from the incredible conversation that is about to happen between these two. So take it away, Camilla and Hayat.
Thank you, Daisy. And yes, welcome everyone to our very first Comms Corner. Very excited to kick this off and also just involve Camilla as well, who has a lot of information purely within Comms Council. So Camilla, for anyone who might not know you, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work within Liverpool City Council?
Absolutely. Afternoon to you, and thanks ever so much for the opportunity to take part. So as Daisy said, my name is Camilla Mankabady. I'm the Communications Director at Liverpool City Council. So that means I have responsibility for all of the communications that we as a council produce, also all of the marketing collateral, and we work really strategically in Liverpool, which is a very positive thing to do. So I'm very lucky to say I get the chance to help shape comms across the city. Actually in a lot of areas that you wouldn't normally associate with a council. So that's been a really exciting experience for me and a really positive experience. I've worked at the council for just over 2 years now. So I always say I'm very new to local government, and I guess I've got to stop saying that soon, because I think when you're nearly at 2.5 years, you're not that new. But I guess when you compare it to my previous career, which I was in for more than 20 years, you can sort of see why I still think of myself as the new girl. So I used to be a journalist, and I guess if you work as a journalist or have ever worked as a journalist, you always think of yourself as a journalist. And I guess I shouldn't probably use the past tense, because I do think of myself as a journalist, and all my colleagues will say, gosh, you never stop asking questions enough, you know, you don't need to anymore. But actually, I think if that's what makes you tick, that's what you're going to do. So I was a journalist for many years, as I said. I started off in radio, which I loved. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to dip my toe into TV and just see how it goes. And actually, that became my first love. And I absolutely adored it. And I was lucky enough to work on some really special programs with some really brilliant people. So for a huge period of time, I was working on the 10 o'clock news on BBC One, which is the most watched news program in the UK and in Europe. So that was a really great privilege to work with some really brilliant talent and to work on some very important stories. I then went over to work at ITV News and worked on News at 10 at ITV, and that was also a really interesting experience. Quite similar to the BBC, but then also very different. And I think that's quite interesting when you're in one organisation which is public service broadcast and the other which is commercial. You do notice the changes. I then went off to live in France for a while, which I loved. And rather bizarrely, I worked with an American network in France, which kind of doesn't make sense, does it? But I guess if I tell you a bit more, it does. So I went to work with Euronews, which is the most watched TV channel in Europe. It doesn't have such a great footprint in Britain. It's not that known. But the Americans at one stage were very keen to establish a channel. And so I ended up working with NBC and Euronews, which I loved. But there was always something about coming home. And you might have guessed I don't really have the strongest Scouse accent, but I'm a really proud Scouser. And so having left home at 18, 30 odd years later, here I am, I'm back in the city. And so that's my journey from journalism into comms. And actually there is a real fluidity, and I don't think you do one and not the other. I think they are very connected.
Interesting, because you primarily come from a news journalism background. So has there been any crossover directly into your success within comms for the council?
It's really interesting. And I think, you know, it would be good to hear what others say, and I think as your series develops, you'll get some different viewpoints. My boss he's got some really great insight actually, and one of the reasons he hired me was to be a little bit different and to think a little bit differently. So you know, I do actually say to a lot of people, look, I'm not a local government person through and through. I understand the sector. I think the sector is really important, and I really like working in the sector. But I bring something very different to the table. And I think, you know, when you have worked as a journalist for many, many years, you do approach every story from the perspective of what will the journalist do with the story? What are the negatives they're going to be looking out for? What are the positives? What's the journey of the story? And I always say to my team, there are 3 phases of a story. You've got your pre-comms, you've got the middle of the event, the heart of the comms, and you've got your post-comms. And there's a very different narrative. And that's, I think, how I approach everything, whether it's a planned event or a planned communication, or whether it's a crisis communication. So absolutely, I think the way I've worked and the way I've run newsrooms certainly does inform how I run my comms and marketing team at the moment.
That makes perfect sense. And being bold and different and having those different segments within the comms, especially when it comes to crisis comms, you know, Liverpool was the home of the much heralded community testing pilot and recently been chosen to host events as part of the National Events Research Programme. How do you manage communications within such high profile scenarios?
It's been incredible. It's been such a busy, I'd say 12 months, 15 months. And, you know, I'd always had a very, very busy kind of day job in the past, but I have to say, I don't think I've actually worked harder than I have done over the last year. And that's not just me. Of course, that's not just me. I think others watching this today will feel exactly the same. It's been an extraordinary time. But when you're working on events that are so critical and of such national importance as basically the first ones of their type, you know that you've got to get it right. And there's so many people who get involved and there's so much at stake that you put the hours in. And it has been a really interesting time. I've learned a lot about myself as a person, as a human being. I've learned a lot about myself as a colleague and as a manager, leading my team. I've learned a great deal about my city, which I love. And you know what, as a comms professional, I learn every day. And I always used to say in a newsroom, you know, for me, a good day was when I went home and I'd learned something new. There's no shame in doing that. And actually, I think for all of us, we should, you know, when we're, you know, in normal times, back on the bus or the train or in the car or walking home, however we get there, for me, it's about, what did I learn today? What did I bring to the table that if I hadn't have been in my role, we wouldn't have done? And there were so many occasions when I just thought, wow, we're really knocking it out the park here. It's been a very difficult time. And I think, you know, Liverpool, one of those cities that has faced a great deal of hardship. And as a communicator, that has been central to what we've been delivering. For me, our messages needed to land because quite literally people's lives were at stake. And I don't think you can have a more important comms campaign than that, when actually you've got the health of your residents at the heart of what you're trying to do. So it's been quite a humbling experience. And I know that sometimes people will say that quite glibly, but for me, it's been a very formative experience. And I feel very fortuitous that I've been in my role during this time.
Yeah, and I'd completely agree, especially with our clients that we've had within the local council. I think they've just been completely relied upon during this time, and especially within crisis comms. But how do you think comms is perceived within local government and Liverpool City Council specifically? And do you think that local councils recognise the importance of the communications function?
I think this last year has been a really interesting year for communicators, and I think it's also signalled a real seismic shift in how we're viewed. I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? So I think if you take the sort of the binary view, children's services, adult services versus communications, if your money's only going to go so far, people would have to make some tough choices there. And I think that was in some quarters how communications was viewed in the past, something that was nice to have, but not integral. And I think one of the interesting issues that has been raised during the pandemic is how important communications is. And when you get the communications wrong, what terrible negative impact you can have. So I think, as I alluded to at the start of this conversation, my boss really gets comms and is very appreciative of what myself and my team do and knows the real importance of getting it right. I think for some other local authorities where maybe communications wasn't considered so central, I think that has all changed this year. You know, and I'm not in the world of criticising colleagues because I don't think that's helpful to anybody. But I think we all know some communication messages have landed better than others during this last year. And I think for me as communicators, we need to be very bold in our approach, very direct in our approach, but also keep learning. So if your message didn't land, why was that? Did you have the wrong objective? Did your assets not work? Did you put it at the wrong time of day? You know, those things for me are very, very important to every day just kind of look at where you're at. Is your message resonating? If not, why not? If it is, why? Is it just by chance? Or are you actually doing something that's really speaking to people? So I think communications probably is in the best health it's been for a long time. I don't think that takes away from the fact that many teams struggle with resource. And I think that's, you know, resource of people, but resource budget-wise, and sometimes resource of kit, actually. We now live in this 24/7 world, and we are expected to respond to things as they happen. But if somebody's working from home and doesn't have the kit that they need, that's really, really difficult. So I think for me, as we try and emerge into some sort of normality, I don't think comms should go back to what it used to be. I think the way that we have worked during the pandemic is probably the way we will work going forward, where we have to be very fleet of foot, we have to be incredibly agile, but we also have to work almost as some regards as individuals. We need to be that real deal that can do all of those skills. You know, if you're out and about, it's about being able to publish a post, being able to take an image, or maybe being able to film something, as well as sending a press release or talking to the press. Those for me are key skills that all communicators need. And I think one of the things that I realized when I joined the communications world was that it was quite a siloed mentality, where some people had great skills, but they were skills that were trammeled. They were in a very, very tight framework. And one of the things that I've tried to do with my team is to open that up. We're all communicators. Maybe we communicate via design and we're known as a graphic designer. Maybe we communicate via the press, or maybe it's via our staff and internal comms, but you need all of the same skills and you need to be able to work at pace. And I think the pace aspect is something I've certainly inherited from newsrooms. I worked in an environment that was about minutes and seconds. And I think for some of my colleagues, that was a little bit of a shock to the system. For me, if there's a good talking point, that's the moment at which you enter the conversation. It isn't the next day or 2 days later when you've had lots of meetings to discuss the strategy. Sometimes strategy and bringing everybody around the table is really important, but other days it's understanding that unless you get that message out there now, somebody else is going to fill that vacuum.
That makes complete sense. And when it comes to, you know, hypothetically having a team member or even a boss who doesn't have that pace alongside the quality that these good comms people are doing within the local authority, what's a good way to, you know, create a good culture and atmosphere to improve the pace of comms?
I think it's about clear decision making, and it's also about clear communication. And I think, you know, many of us will have experienced it. We're communicators, but sometimes it's the lacking of communication that leads to a message being slightly blurred. So what I've introduced since I joined my team is a daily team meeting. So if I'm available, I will gather with my team at 9:30 every day. If I'm not available, somebody else will take charge of that meeting. And so that meeting for me is to discuss the key lines of the day. What are the key messages that we would like to put out that day? What are the key times we would like to put them out? And how are we going to get that message out there? Is it a graphic? Is it a video clip? Is it a really well-written piece of copy? Is it a press release that goes out to the press? Or is it ensuring that one of our key spokespeople is available to do interviews later that day? All forms of communication are as valid as each other. Some days it may not be what's on our own channels, but it's about what information we can give to our community groups and to ensure that they disseminate the word. So for me, that 9:30 meeting is really, really pivotal. So not only do we discuss the expectations of the day, and the deadlines of the day. But we also look back to the previous day or the previous week if it's a Monday morning, and we discuss as a team what worked and what didn't work. And I think when I first started that approach, some people found that quite an unusual approach. We're not the greatest as a nation, I think, of talking about what didn't go wrong. It feels uncomfortable, doesn't it? What didn't go so well. But I think for me, it's about we only learn if we acknowledge, and that's not about a blame game. We work as a team, and we're all, if something doesn't quite work, then we're all culpable. If something works, we're all in it together. It's one of those things. And I've learned a great deal from my team. And I always say you'll often get your brightest and most imaginative ideas probably from the quietest person on the team. So it's just about encouraging everybody to have a voice. Some people aren't comfortable in speaking out publicly, so it might be better for them to send me a separate WhatsApp message or a separate email. But equally, I sort of seem to understand my colleagues a little bit better now, and I'll know if somebody's got something that they probably want to say, but maybe don't feel that comfortable. And I'll try and find the time during that day just to pick their brains. So for me, it's about gathering every day and being very forensic about what you want to achieve. It's not necessarily about the quantity, it's about the quality. For example, we had a really great blog that we pushed out last week. So we have found a contributor who works in one of our partner organizations, and she is experiencing long COVID, and she has agreed to write a blog every time that she's reached a milestone. And we pushed out a blog that she'd written for us last week. It didn't do quite so well. And then bizarrely, we pushed it out at exactly the same time the next day, and that was something that I needed to raise. So why did we do that? We knew that that time of day wasn't the right time for people to consume that kind of content. So why did we just kind of go through the ropes and push it out again the same time the next day? So it's those little things that we will talk about. But equally, we will talk about, wow, that interview was brilliant. How do we max out on that? Is there anything else we can do? Is this message spent, or do we take it in a new direction? And I think for me, the best meetings are when we get different ideas from the team. So I might come with my prepared agenda, but the most fruitful meetings are when somebody else comes up with a much better idea. And that happens very often. And for me, it's about giving people the time to breathe and to not think, oh, I'm in work mode, and so what I've got to say has got to be incredibly intellectual, or it's got to be rooted in local government. What is it, the thing that you've been talking about with your family over the breakfast table, or when you've just sent your friend a WhatsApp this morning? What was that message? Because actually it's often that stuff that is the richest and is something that we can take and turn into more of a citywide conversation.
That makes complete sense. And we also have the same thing every day, and we call it a daily stand-up, where we speak about our blockers or any issues from the day before and what we're doing the next day. So I'm curious, so we've spoken about the day-to-day activity, but do you have like a monthly plan or a yearly plan? Like how far in advance are you looking?
Yeah, so for me, we do work on a grid system. I think that's really, really important to do so. And we will put events and key message days in the diary as far ahead as we can. I would say probably most of them are within the year. And we have a weekly planning meeting. We have that on a Thursday afternoon. It feels like we've had a really good sense of the week that's almost finishing. We've got a good sense of what's coming up the following week. But I do have separate conversations, separate email threads with my two project managers who help run the marketing team. And we look at events that are further afield. So for example, I held a meeting this morning for some members of my team and some key stakeholders in the city about an event that's taking place in the middle of May. And I really want to land this event and make sure that we hit all aspects of it and all different types of the press. So for me, that's a significant moment for the city that I want to get it right. So I will have quite a few meetings leading up to such a big day. So I think for me, it's about being flexible, but you all need to know what's on the horizon. Something else that I do that I think is very useful. Everything's been slightly thrown out by the pandemic, and obviously a lot of our news is about public health at the moment. But what I like to do is spend time with all of the key directors, so they're the key stakeholders in the organisation, and I want to find out, so in the calendar year, what are the big milestones for you? what are the big stories, what are the key messages. And what I've done is put that together in a report, and I've got that basically signed off by the top table, by the senior managers, to say, look, we all agree that these are some of the key messages that reflect the city plan for Liverpool and reflect the values of the organisation of Liverpool City Council. We've all signed up to this. And I think for communicators where resources tight, I mean, of course it is for all of us, it's actually really good to have that. So that's our blueprint. These are the things, the messages that we really need to deliver on. But of course, if other messages come along or crisis comms come along, they will obviously be the most important messages. I think it helps sort of straighten out the kind of the messages that people would like to have, but actually they don't really fit with our broader narrative, and we simply don't have time to sadly keep everybody happy. So it's really important that, I would say, communicators have a weekly plan, a daily plan, a monthly plan, and an annual plan.
Makes complete sense. And even we at React and Share, we're absolutely obsessed with measuring our efforts to prove our work to internal stakeholders. So with your internal stakeholders, what measurements do you think that the local authority comms teams should be presenting to their board?
I think this is a really interesting one, actually. And I think for me, it's about really having clear sight of what your objectives are when you launch a campaign or when you're planning a campaign. And I think the objectives will be very, very different depending on what the message is that you're trying to land. And I think also within the campaign, you will have different moments when different objectives become more important than others. So if I take lateral flow testing as an example, and you mentioned that a few moments ago. So Liverpool decided and was chosen to be the city that was going to roll out smart community testing. And this was a really, really big endeavour for us in the communications team. We had to get it right, and we had to get it right really quickly. I remember being in the supermarket on a Saturday afternoon with my boss. It was about 10 to 4 in the afternoon. I was still in the supermarket at 5 o'clock, but I was on my first Zoom call with key stakeholders from the city and the Department of Health and Social Care and other government representatives at 5 o'clock. I don't think I got home till about 7 o'clock that evening because I just couldn't move. I just thought, I'll just keep standing where I'm standing and get this one going. So if we think about that campaign in particular, my objective at the start was to make sure that most people, all people in Liverpool who were eligible for a test, knew that the testing regime was coming. So my first 10 days to 2 weeks was about mass awareness, mass saturation. And that's when our critical friends of the media became a really, really good helpful source. We had media briefings with the local paper, the local radio stations, the regional TV networks to explain to them why we were taking this approach and why we thought it would be beneficial to the community. We also talked about some of the downsides that might appear as a result of it. So we were very open and very transparent, but we also made it clear that we needed their support, and we had a great support. So that was kind of like, if you like, my first comms message, my objective. And your question was, well, how do you audit this? So for me, it was very, very clear. I know how many people live in Liverpool, and I knew how many people were eligible. And we were doing a lot of testing to see, was our message landing? Where was it landing? Where were people getting their information? So within a couple of weeks, we knew that most people in the city knew about the campaign. So that was kind of, for me, job done on point one. What I then needed to do was be a little bit more sophisticated in my thinking. And for us, for this system to work, we needed to embrace those who sometimes are known as the hard to reach. I prefer to use the phrase the seldom heard. So these are our residents and communities in our city that are really important. But sometimes, you know, the likes of local government or authorities or government and other key stakeholders, they just don't talk to them. You know, they're not the groups, the organizations they want to hear from, that they necessarily feel fit into their sphere of influence or into their orbit. And so for me, that was the most interesting and the most challenging time. It was about who were those groups and how were we going to reach them? And for me, those groups were very different. And there was very different reasons why they weren't keen to come forward for lateral flow testing. And what I had to do was to shape my messaging to fit that group. And again, I knew how many people were in those groups. And again, that was my indicator. our Director of Public Health in Liverpool is a really great guy. He's called Matt Ashton, and he has spent a lot of time bringing this message to the wider population, but also nationally. And we every day would go through the data, looking at where were we reaching and weren't we reaching. And for me, the exciting times and imaginative times about being a communicator is what are the tools you can use to reach those people. So for example, we discovered that there were 4 hard to reach groups, and one of those was young professionals. So these were young men and women who lived in the city centre. Many of them were furloughed, many of them were working from home at their laptop, didn't feel ill, didn't feel the need to go and have a lateral flow. So we just weren't reaching those people. So we had to find a way of talking to them. So one way was to establish community testing centres in the places where they would go. So we've got this amazing shopping centre in Liverpool called Liverpool One, and it's got one of the highest footfalls in the country. It's a very popular place. So we used a retail unit and turned it into a testing centre. And what we got there was a load of young professionals who lived around the corner who would feel inclined to go into that centre because they might have been nipping to the supermarket or to a chemist or one of the essential stores that was open. Another approach that we took, which I think has probably got to be my favourite, if you're allowed to have favourites. So we've got a brilliant community in the postcode of L8 in Liverpool. Many of you will know the area. It's Toxteth, and it's a great area. It's a really vibrant area. But we discovered that some people who live in L8 just didn't really think lateral flows were for them. Variety of reasons. And you know, if you come along and say, look, I'm from the council, we think it's really important that you give this a go, that's going to fall on deaf ears. We found the most charismatic ice cream seller, this wonderful guy who has been delivering ice creams to generations of families in that community. If anybody is going to trust anybody, they're going to trust him. So he was very kind to us. We gave him a bundle of leaflets. We spoke to him. We advised him on what to say. And as people were queuing up for their ice creams, you remember last summer we had some good weather, didn't we? And even towards the autumn, the weather was quite good. So that was when we got this chappie out and about, and he helped us out with some of our key COVID messaging. So for me, I think it's about understanding what it is you're trying to achieve and what's the most effective way of achieving it. And I think some of us get obsessed with numbers, don't we? So we look at a social media post and we say, wow, look at the reach on this. Our message landed. Did it really? Were people engaged enough? You know, did it really have that impact that you think it did? And I think sometimes we've got to step back from the big figures and just look at the reality often about the message. And sometimes, you know, the message is a hard message, and you might cut it one way and it doesn't deliver. And you need to step back into your meeting and work out, how creatively do we get this out there again and actually make it more successful for us?
That makes perfect sense. And just out of curiosity, how did you like incentivize the ice cream guy to get involved? Because I would have assumed like it might have been a bit difficult. I don't know. Pairing up a lateral test with, you know, a 99 flake.
He's just a good guy. And I think, you know, Liverpool is something about Scousers. There's a real community spirit. And I think, you know, wherever you are in the UK, you've probably got that place in your city, in your town, in your village, where you just know there were some really great influencers, some great ambassadors, and there are some really good people out there doing some really good work. And he, for us, is one of those key people in one of our grassroots community areas. And he was very kind. One of the things he said to us is, look, I don't want to be famous. I don't want to do media. That's not what I'm about, but I'm very happy to talk to the locals. And we were like, you know what, that's absolutely fine for us. So long as the message lands and people realize that, you know, there's an outbreak and there are things that we can do to help, that's all we need. And he was very kind to us.
That's amazing. And I love that out of the box thinking. And I think it's very smart that you went with someone who was trusted within the community and outside of the scope of the government, because I would assume that that's like a huge thing amongst a certain segment, which is like their trust of the government in general. Like, how do you target your comms towards those people? How far out of the box should comms people go for those people? Or are these people just, I don't know, do we give up on them? Like, what do we do?
I think we need to keep going. It's really, really important. And I think that's when you produce your most fruitful comms, when you realize you're having an impact on all quarters. And I try and put myself in those people's shoes, for a variety of very good reasons. They don't feel that authority or stakeholders speak to them. Well, then we're obviously speaking to them completely badly. We're speaking to them in the wrong language and using the wrong tools. So how do we reach them? And I think sometimes for me, the measure of success is not the content or the assets that you're producing and putting out on your own channels or the mainstream channels, but it's those grassroots, it's those WhatsApps, it's those community groups, those neighborhood groups. That for me is often where the real worth is. It has been harder during the pandemic. Often we would literally get people out there knocking on doors, chatting to people at the supermarket, in the community center. It hasn't been quite as easy to do that. But I absolutely say to people as communicators, let's not give up, let's not walk away. The most heartwarming is when those messages land. We've got a brilliant Caribbean centre in Liverpool, and if people get the chance to go down there, it's a really vibrant place. It's run by a group of formidable women. They're absolutely fantastic. We knew that many of our community from the Black community, whether that was from a Black African origin or Caribbean origin, didn't feel very confident in actually stepping forward into local authority buildings or those sorts of places. So the organisers of the community centre allowed us to set up a testing centre in their building. And what was wonderful is that they would bring food, and they supported people as they came along for their test. They made them feel at ease. And in the first few weeks of doing our smart testing, we had some really great support from the British Army, from the MOD. And that was one of the test centres that was run by young squaddies. And we got some really, really great anecdotes and some charming pictures of these young lads in the main. There were some young women there as well, but there was mostly young male soldiers who were there being charmed by these wonderful women. And that for me was actually what the community testing was all about. It was bringing together people who might not necessarily have come together ordinarily, and it's trying to bring down those barriers for when cities and towns and villages are back to normal. And I think we all know the parts of our communities that are being left behind. And we've really got to up our game to ensure that that doesn't happen. And I think for me, one of the really salutary understandings of the pandemic is that that inequality gap has really deepened. And that's a worry for all of us in local authorities. And it's about what we can do to change that.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think what was very smart about what you guys are doing and how you're doing such great work at Liverpool City Council is the fact that not only have you positioned the council and the government and the local authorities as just more down to earth place, but also you didn't kind of set up these barriers where you were forcing your community to come to you, but actually you were going out to them. You were adapting your messaging and your comms efforts for them and where they were, as opposed to being like, this is our testing center in the middle of nowhere, and forcing them to travel out and not thinking about the disparities and the different inequalities there. So I think it sounds fantastically, I don't know, you just spot on in my opinion. So what can you guys are doing great work and have a great foundation, a great team. What about the small teams or the local authority teams who are having cutbacks and are being furloughed and just don't have the resource to do what you're doing, these out of the box thinkings and the resources that go behind it? How can they have as much impact as you guys within their local authorities?
That's a really good question. And, my heart goes out to those teams that feel under pressure and don't feel that they can deliver in the way that they would want to. I would say step back from that and think about who are the key local influencers in that community or that networking sphere, and approach them. And it may well be that, you're literally one person on your own running a comms team or a very, very small team. So clearly your own work is not going to shift the dial 100%. You're going to need to rely on others. So for me, it's about thinking about co-creation and strategic working. So it might be that one of your key stakeholders has got an objective that they need to reach, that you can help reinforce by sharing or helping to develop content. And that means the pressure's not just on one team, but you spread the burden. And I found over the last year, but certainly over the last 2 years, that the more you work together, the more you establish those bonds. And actually it feels very odd to step back into your siloed world and just work for your own authority or your own entity. So I would say be really strategic in your thinking. You know, if you are literally a very, very small team and you feel like you're being pulled from pillar to post, what are your organization's key objectives that you need to land over the year? And how do they fit in with your other stakeholders in your other community? Can you come together? So if you've got 5 objectives that you need to land for the next year, is it that you can take responsibility for 2, but the other stakeholders take responsibility for the other 3, and you work together and you share ideas, you share resource? I think most communicators are very happy to help when others are really feeling the strain. So if one of your colleagues and stakeholders is under pressure, maybe they're dealing with crisis comms, or they've got a sickness issue or another issue that they're dealing with, you know, step away from your work for a day, a couple of days, a week, help them out. They will help you out. Look at who's got social media followings in your patch. There are lots of great people out there who do have the influence of their neighbors, friends, communities. And if you can bring those people on board so that they feel that they are also co-creating, then they will help you. I was at a great seminar recently where the Newham principle, and now adopted by Birmingham, was discussed. And this is about having community champions. I think we are all cognizant of the fact that we can't all do it. We just can't do everything, and we certainly can't do it on our own. And I think it's about harnessing who are those key people in those communities that will have much more impactful reach than you will have. So absolutely incredibly daunting if you're sat in your organization's meeting and you come out with a long list and you're thinking, how on earth am I going to do this? You know, there just simply aren't enough days in the week or hours in the day to deliver. Okay, think strategically. Who are the people that are going to help you out that you would help out, vice versa? That's how I would say you should approach it. And I think for me, pooling resource is also very good. And also thinking about the assets that you produce. So for me, it's thinking about producing templated assets is often that's something that's overlooked. You know, it would be great, wouldn't it, to produce a different look and feel for every key message or every marketing campaign or every comms campaign that you roll out, but it's simply not effective. And actually you might think, you know what, it's actually quite important that people understand that this message has come around again. Because they recognize the brand and the feel. And I would say to people, don't feel like you've got to reinvent the wheel every time. Actually get a really good foundation and tweak that foundation, and that just might help you. But you're not alone. There is support out there. And you know, if you work for a local authority, we have the really brilliant Local Government Association, and they will support colleagues, and they really want to support colleagues. So if you feel that you would need a bit of extra resource for a finite period, I would say they are a very, very good place to start. Also LG Comms, so they're a really great sounding board. Maybe you're wrestling with a problem and you don't really have the confidence of another communicator in your area, or you don't feel like you know people well enough. You know, again, that's a really useful resource where you can, you know, you can put a query into the mix, and you know, somebody will probably help and respond and tell you what they've done. Set up your own network as well. There will always be people that you think similarly to, and it's just very nice to know that you're not alone. I have done that. So I'm based in Liverpool, and I've built up a really great rapport with Alan, who runs the comms and marketing team in Manchester. And you know, we're only down the road from each other, and sometimes we face slightly different pressures, but we kind of think a lot of the time the same sort of thing. And you know, occasionally it's just really nice to say, oh my goodness, I've had a terrible week, how are you doing? Just something as simple as that. Or actually, sometimes if you've got a slightly thornier issue, it's like, I'm thinking of doing this. Is this what you would do? And really, there is no shame. Actually, it's really important to have that confidence, to not be arrogant, and to think, I think this might be a really good way of landing a message. But you know what? I'm just going to check in with somebody that I really value their opinion, and I'm just going to see what they say.
Makes perfect sense. Is there any rivalry with Alan in Manchester, or?
Well, you're going to have to ask Alan that. I would say probably not. He's a really, really delightful guy. We haven't actually met because of the pandemic. It's prevented us from meeting. So we keep saying when we can, we're going to go out for a very long awaited drink. But he's a really good ally. And so, you know, there's been some bumpy news stories coming out of Liverpool over the last few weeks and months. And he's been very supportive in sending me messages going, you know, keep going. You're doing all right. Well done, you. And, you know, I hope I'm that support for him. But you know what? Rivalry is really good. I like rivalry, so long as it's healthy rivalry. You know, certainly I would never advocate, you know, sort of, you know, dirty tricks or any of that. Absolutely not. But I think sort of going back to my journalistic roots, for me, one of the things that I would always do is look at what the competition was doing. And, you know, that was because I admired what they were doing. But I also think seeing what everybody else is doing helps you raise your game. If you're in your own little bubble, you might think you're doing the best job in the world, and actually it might be really outdated, or you might have missed something really obvious. And you do need that kind of that sort of peer support, but also that peer understanding. And so you know, for me, I use social media to look at what friends and colleagues in different sectors are doing. So of course I'm aware of who's moving and shaking things in local government. But for me, I think sometimes the most valuable lessons I've learned are looking at sectors that are so different from local government. And I think that's a really good way of making yourself feel quite vibrant and not becoming stale. I really like what the Aussies and the New Zealanders do. I think some of the organizations in New York do some brilliant work. And I think it's just about thinking, what is it you like as an individual? And why do you like that kind of comms? What is it that's speaking to you? And is that something that you can take away and use? And, you know, we always say imitation's the sincerest form of flattery, don't we? And, you know, I've really got something in that. So we have got this beautiful park in Liverpool called Sefton Park, which many of you may have heard of. And Central Park and Sefton Park have got many, many similarities. And John Lennon used to live near Sefton Park, and when he moved to America, he wanted to live near Central Park because it made him think of home. And so I will often look at what Central Park are doing on their Twitter feed because they are brilliant. We have got an amazing parks feed that my team take responsibility for. But you know what? There is no shame in looking at what the Americans are doing and just sometimes taking an idea or two. And sometimes it's wonderful to think, you know what? We did that a few weeks ago. Isn't that great? It was obviously a good idea because someone else is doing it. I quite like that. And I think for me, being a communicator, you've got to be across what's on trend, what's on point, what the national conversation is saying. And I think the pandemic has changed people's priorities. And I'm very interested in how marketeers in the commercial sector have adapted. And I've never worked in that sector, but I do admire them and I do watch them very closely. And I think for me, we've seen a real ethical strand emerge over the last year. You know, it's simply not good enough talking about what a great product you've got, but what's your footprint? What's your footprint in the local community? Do you empathize with the fact that many people have had a very, very difficult time or are still experiencing a very difficult time? And I think people now are often thinking twice before they spend their money. Where are they spending it? Where is it going? And I think marketeers have got a very, very important element to play in that about, you know, how is your product perceived? Who do you want to buy it? So I think for me, look around you, keep your eyes open, but understand why you like something, and also understand why a message doesn't land with you. What is it you didn't like about that message? Is it you as an individual and you're railing against something? Or is it because that message just didn't speak to anybody? And I find that fascinating. And look, it's not a science, is it? It's all really, really subjective. But I do think as communicators, you do need to be quite opinionated, and you need to stand by your decisions. So if you take a campaign in a certain direction and it doesn't work out, own that failure, learn from that failure and move on from it. Equally, if a campaign is a major success, don't rest on your laurels. Why was it successful? And if you replicated that campaign again, would you reach the same objectives? And if not, why not? So for me, it's always about keeping learning and just keeping on your toes where you can be.
Makes perfect sense. And one of the things that I've realized with my very short time within comms is I've noticed a lot of comms professionals being very into social and very into press and, you know, all of that good stuff, which is very exciting. But I haven't noticed that level of excitement when it comes to like comms on the website. And when I, as just a person, you know, local citizen of, you know, within London, whenever I need any information from my local authority, the first place I go is the website. And I always feel a little bit like underserved by it. Do you feel like this is a common occurrence, or do you think that my opinion is just like a one-off?
I think you're absolutely spot on. I really do. And I think from my perspective, I think the website is quite a complex beast, isn't it? Because it's trying to do a lot of things for a lot of people. I would say most people use a local government website for very transactional purposes. So it might be that they want to know opening times, or when is their bin collection coming round, or when is that community centre open, or who is their councillor, which ward do they live in. And we look at the analytics every week, and actually it's very interesting to see which are the most viewed pages. Probably no surprise that liverpool.gov.uk pretty much over the last few months is everything to do with COVID that has been the most read. And people are very interested in the case data that we've been putting out. So how many cases there are in Liverpool, in the different wards, etc. Because I'm a news junkie, and you've probably worked that one out, doesn't take too much time to work that one out, I have worked very closely with our digital team to embolden the amount of content that we have, and to make it quite simply look as lively as possible. So I know that most people actually just land on the page that they want. They don't necessarily land on the front page, but I do know that those who don't use online services as much, who are slightly older, probably will go to the front page. And so for me, what I wanted to do was make our news footprint as big as possible on there. And my team have been very helpful, my colleagues in the digital team. And what we have now also done is, for example, if you're clicking on to see if your bin collection is going to be changed because of the bank holiday, what you will also find on that page is any articles, videos, tweets that we've done about bins. And actually you might just think, gosh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that scheme was running. That's quite interesting. And for me, what's key is increasing dwell time. And I find dwell time absolutely fascinating. And I also think when you can navigate where somebody's gone from and where they end up is very interesting. But I agree with you. I think because those sites are very transactional, and they need to be there, and there's a lot of things that we need to put on there because that's the legislation and that's the information we need to provide. I think sometimes people are a little bit scared about providing personality and creativity. And I would say, I think probably all of us can improve our offer there. Because for some people, you know, the thought of following on social media a local authority is just really not what they do, would never have an aspiration to do that. And I just think it's so important that people understand what their councils provide and how integral they are to their everyday lives, actually. So for me, if we've got it wrong on the Gov UK page, we've kind of lost it almost, actually. So that's something that I look at often. It's not in my auspices of control. It's another team that look after that website, but we do work really collaboratively, which I think is important. And again, that's another way of co-creating. So we're across the content in a much more kind of close-up, detailed way than my digital colleagues are. But of course, they know exactly how to lay it out, what's going to work, what's not going to work. And so I think we're a good combination. But you're right, I think there is more that we can do.
And that's very interesting that you spoke about dwell time as well, because I wrote up a very recent report all about like read time and dwell time across different authorities that anyone can access from reactandshare.com, not to make it a sales pitch. But also in terms of like the metrics behind that, we found it very interesting, where we are huge advocates of actually using Google Analytics for the quantitative data. And again, React and Share, we actually provide the qualitative data, so pairing it up is actually really useful. But I see the synonymy with like the digital team and like working closely with them to hit your goals, because what I find interesting within comms is spending so much time and resource on a campaign, but then leading it to a website or a page that just isn't relaying that message. But I think what you guys are doing, which is so great, is actually using the assets that you've already created on your socials and showcasing that as part of the content. I think that's very smart and very efficient. So that makes complete sense. I think there's a lot to be learned from that. Have you noticed any uptick or any, you know, longer spent or greater dwell time on that by having that?
Absolutely. And I think the more interesting content you provide, then the more people are willing to linger. And I think we've all done that. You know, we've all accessed a particular website because we had one particular thing in mind, and then we saw something else that we were interested in, and off we went. And then we saw something else, and then there was a video that we clicked on. Then there was a great photo that we had to look at, you know, and before you know it, you're hooked on that website. And then actually the next time you need a bit of information, you know that that's the place to go to. One word of sort of caution I would add, I think sometimes, I'm not going to say lazy communications, but I think sometimes we will get asked for a website. Can you produce a website on X, please? And I think there is really a time and a place for that. And I think if you are going to produce a website, you have got to provide the content, and you've got to keep it a very lively, creative proposition. There is nothing worse than clicking on a website that looks incredibly unloved and is just sat there gathering dust. So this morning I was in a meeting where we discussed a website and actually this one will get the green light from me because it serves two purposes. So we have got a very exciting building that we are going to be announcing and opening in Liverpool in the next few weeks. And so for me, the purpose of having this website is twofold. So the first place is, if you are hearing about this building, you might think, gosh, I want to know a bit more. So the actual landing page and the initial spec will be all the details. But actually, the broader, more important purpose of the website is effectively to use it as a promotional tool. So if you or your company would like to be based in this building, then this is how you can go about it. So that's why I think that's a very, very useful resource. But there have been other websites that I have knocked back recently because I simply don't want to take responsibility for lots and lots of platforms. For me, it's all about rationalizing the platforms down and also having this real family look and feel. So if I'm accessing a feed about Liverpool's parks, I want it to have the same tone and look and feel as the corporate channel. I need people to understand that it's all the one and the same. And I think that's very important. And I think sometimes people's willingness to say yes and their ambition overrides the kind of pragmatic approach, which is stepping back and thinking, do we really want this? Would this be a good enough call in a year's time? And if the answer is no, then I think there are probably better ways of using that time or that money or the other resource.
And I can see a win-win effect there, because not only because you're creating that consistency across the different websites and your socials, it would kind of like get your team kind of excited about a website, which typically no one really feels that way. But also, secondly, from the person who's actually visiting the website or the company who wants to get involved with the new development and get, you know, that office space or whatever, it just continues on this great comms message that you've created and that consistency there. And that's the one thing as a person, just a local citizen, is the fact that I sometimes, when I visit random different local authority websites, I see that their website feels neglected and it feels like a very different tone of voice. It feels like, I don't know, like it was created in the 90s and left there. But their social media is so fun, so engaging, it's great. But I think what I've noticed is, sure, that's great, but you know, a post from yesterday I would have lost. There's no way I'm going to find that. But something that's on the website, I am going to potentially see a good few times because I'm actively looking for it. So I think that's yeah, I think what you guys are doing is definitely worth listening to and worth taking on board, creating that consistency and making it hyper focused. That's what I've learned from this conversation. You guys seem hyper focused on what your objectives are and make everything align with that. So I know that we're coming to the end now, and I have a couple more questions for you, Camilla. What is the definition of success within comms for you and your local authority? And is there a difference between the success measurement between internal and external comms?
It's a really interesting question. I think for me, successful comms is when it's relevant comms. And, I rail against vanity projects, and I rail against, can we just do this, please? Because, it's going to help us out. No, we're just not doing it, and I don't want to lose friends here, but we've just got to be very, very strategic. So I feel very satisfied in an evening when I'm looking at our social media feed, and I'm looking at the life of the city and what has happened that day in Liverpool, in the Northwest, in the nation. And if I feel that we're hitting some of those local or national conversations, then I really feel it's been a successful day. For me, I hate it when we try too hard, actually. And I think successful comms is all about comms that have integrity as well. And, I think it's great when there's a trend and something goes viral and you get a load of clicks and people think, wow, that team are really clever. Does it change any behavior? Does it really lead to impactful change? And we've spoken for an hour now, which is just extraordinary because it feels like 10 minutes. But for me, nudge behavior, I've not mentioned that, which is really remiss of me, because actually that's the heart of what we do. That's what our objectives are all focused around. So for me, if I think we are changing behavior in a really positive way, then I feel like job done. It's a successful comms campaign. And a campaign can be one extraordinary tweet that delivers, or it can be something that's very, very considered, that takes months to unfold. And I think for me, that's the measure of success. Are people reading and looking at your content and your messages? Are they understanding what you are collectively trying to achieve? And for me, again, something will be completely unsuccessful if my narrative is at odds with every other key stakeholder in the city. And so we have regular meetings where we talk about, what are the big ticket items in the city? When the city centre was reopening a few days ago, lots of us came together to discuss what did we want to achieve? How were we going to achieve that together? And you talked about sort of rivalry and competitive. On those moments, you kind of think we're all in it together, guys. So how are we going to bring these messages together so that it's one single voice, not a fractured voice? And I think for me, that is the essence of successful comms. Have you got an authentic voice that people want to listen to?
And it sounds like what can be learnt from our discussion is stay focused, be consistent, vocalize your learnings and your failures, let's just call it what it is, or blockers. Have daily meetings, set up these meetings with the key stakeholders and showcase this as well. I think what I'm learning from you is you're vocalizing a lot of what you're doing and therefore removing the vanity metrics, because a lot of bosses typically, or stakeholders, love these vanity metrics. How many people have we got out to? That's a marker of success. Or even like bounce rate on the website is a mark of success, because they assume, oh, if a person's visited the website and left, that's good. That means that they've been satisfied, when actually it's not. It's all vanity. What you guys are doing, it sounds like it's all quantitative, all like very quality stuff, and you're not afraid to vocalize that. Do you feel like that's correct in what I've heard?
Yeah, and thank you for acknowledging that. And look, we've got some really brilliant people in my team. They, we work together really well. And there are some days when it's hard because we've put our heart and souls into a project, whether it's a video or a design or a piece of copy, and it doesn't get any traction. And we have to stop and think, why? What was it? Is it as simple as we didn't put a thumbnail on the video? Is it because actually we didn't need a spokesperson on that? We could have just had the pictures. Were the pictures a little bit too flat? And you talked about numbers and metrics there. Sometimes you'll look at a video and think, goodness, X 100,000 people have watched that. How many people watched it to the end? How many more watched it longer than 10 seconds? And that's where I think the secondary level of kind of data analytics comes in. I think, when you're sort of starting, to understand this process of looking at the stats. It's just the big number, the global number is what counts. And actually we're in now the phase of really understanding, well, what do those numbers mean for us? And I also think it's about having confidence. So we have lots of channels, which I'm really, really proud about. So we were the first local authority that set up a TikTok feed. We've got a really growing family on Instagram. You know, we love Medium, we love podcasts. But there are some messages that just will not work on Twitter. So there really isn't any point in putting it on. And, you know, I'm not in that world where I'm thinking, gosh, is my boss going to be looking and seeing they haven't posted anything on Twitter today? If it gets pick up and bang for our buck on TikTok or via Insta stories, then that's job done for me. And we're now looking at, you know, what are the age groups that are accessing our comms? What's the gender? You know, where are they based? That sort of information you can pick up depending on the type of post that you're putting out there. And it's really, really critical that all communicators understand their stats. And that goes for internal comms too, because you mentioned internal comms a little while ago. And my internal comms team are great at looking at what are the staff interested in? What are they reading? Why did they click on that video? Why did they respond to that post on the staff Facebook forum? And let's not forget that, you know, staff are key ambassadors and they're also key audience who are key influencers. So often the internal comms barometer is really key to the external. And something that I've started doing recently, which I quite like, is if we have a big story that's coming up, I will often test it internally first and sort of give them a sneak preview. You know what, next Friday we're going to be launching this thing, we're going to be telling the press about this. What do you guys think? And that's a really good way of getting staff on board and on point and across agenda. They're often the ones that are out seeing the public more than us communicators, who are often stuck behind a phone or a laptop or on a Zoom meeting, but they're the ones that are actually dispensing services in the community. So, you know, really think about them as a really key resource as well.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic. I love the idea of testing out internally, because if it works with the people that actually work at the local authority, it will work with everyone else. Subset of our community as a whole. Absolutely love it. And finally, Camilla, what do you hope for the future of communications in the local authority space?
Wow, that's a biggie. Look, you know, I hope for successful communications over the next few months and years. I think communications will keep evolving. And it's really interesting. I've got some great colleagues. Many of them have worked in the local authority for 20 years. And if you look at their career in communications when they started to what it is now, it's a different job. It really is. I would say it's probably a more exciting job. I think it's probably a more challenging job. And I think probably we are producing much more content, if you like to use that word. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where we head in 5 or 10 years' time. I think the protection of data is a big issue at the moment, isn't it? I think citizen journalism is another really big issue. I think also the demise of local paper readership and local radio listenership is interesting. And I think the rise of streaming broadcast is going to change how we all communicate and how we all receive our information. I think for me, we're in quite a bad place with a lot of social media, aren't we? I think for some people it's quite a toxic place, and I would really like to see that narrative change, and for some social media platforms to be a more enlightening experience, maybe a place where proper arguments and discussions are held, and not the sort of the name calling sort of binary world in which we currently live. But I would say we need strong communicators, and we need strong communicators from all backgrounds and of different ages, actually. And I think social media is often considered a young preserve, and we can see why. Obviously, it's a very young medium, but I think for me, you produce the best comms when you really reflect and refract the society that you're trying to represent.
Camilla, thank you so much for joining us on Comms Corner today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a really great hour, and it's always so important to stop and kind of discuss what you do and think about ways of doing it better. I look forward to seeing and hearing some of your other sessions.
I just want to jump in as well and say thank you so much, Camilla. It's been a joy to learn more from you and to obviously get our teeth stuck into the Manchester-Liverpool rivalry, since I'm based in Manchester myself. Camilla, where can our viewers find you if they want to learn more about you and your work at Liverpool City Council?
So I have got a Twitter feed. I'm half Danish, half Egyptian. We didn't get onto that, did we? So my Twitter handle is called DanishGirl4. And I'm very proud of my team's comms, and so I will often share a lot of our content. So that will give you a real flavour of what we do and what the conversation is in Liverpool. We obviously have lots of channels that I mentioned a little while ago, and you can find those under Liverpool Council. And, you know, if people have got comments or thoughts, very happy for you to email me. And obviously it's a very standard email address attached to liverpool.gov.uk.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in to our first ever episode of Comms Corner. Please keep your eyes peeled for the rest of the Comms Corner series. And you can head to reactandshare.com as well to gain more insights and tips for communications professionals. We're always on the lookout for new ways to empower communicators to succeed. So if anyone has any suggestions for us or anything that you'd like to see from the series, then feel free to find us on Twitter at React and Share. Wonderful. Thank you so much.